Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zachary Strong and I've been a scholar for the last 10 years or so. I started out doing educational research in a university and then I went independent and started diving down various rabbit holes in psychology, neuroscience, physics, and history. Um, and today I'm going to be making a video about something called decolonization. So I'm in Canada, and the word decolonization is thrown around a lot. And typically, people interpret decolonization as being an Indigenous issue, an Indigenous thing, and it has to do exclusively with Indigenous issues. However, as I've come to learn and appreciate, there's some more layers to this whole idea of decolonization, and a lot of it has to do with how Western society has changed since industrialization. Since about, the year 1800, European countries and colonies like, Canada and the States and so on, we've undergone some major shifts, economically, in terms of industrialization and urbanization and so on. And it turns out that when you dive into psychology and history and so on, certain things just kind of pop out at you in terms of how our world is organized right now and perhaps how we should be reorganizing it. Okay? And interestingly, a lot of the stuff that I've discovered and learned about, it has to do with decolonization, but not in the sense of like indigenous versus Western, indigenous versus European. It doesn't have anything to do with that. It's just almost like general decolonization. Okay? So in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a little PDF that I'm working on that has to do with these issues, and it summarizes everything relatively simply. Okay? So I've called this Birthright, the truth about human potential. So, part one, the destruction of human nobility. Okay, so basically, in the 1700s, they invented the steam engine. Okay, and the steam engines that were made were able to power machinery, and that made factories possible. Okay, so in the mid 1700s, they were like, oh wow, we can mass produce things and make factories and so on. Okay, and then once they made factories, that's where all the jobs were. So a lot of people moved to cities in search of work. Okay, so in the 1800s, that's when urbanization was happening. Okay, and we learn about this stuff a little bit in history class, but it's not emphasized nearly as much as it should be. Okay, and then also in the 1800s, standardized education became mandatory. Okay, so it started out in the 1700s with Prussia. Okay, and Prussia basically made mandatory standardized education for its citizens. Other countries looked at what Prussia was doing and they were like, oh, this could be really good for us. And so the States started doing it, Canada started doing it, other countries started doing it. And basically they took kids out of, the home or out of apprenticeships or whatever, and they put them in schools to teach them, reading and writing and numbers and so on. Okay? And so this kind of replaced the apprenticeship model that we used to have. And so everyone basically went to school, and then after the school, they went to the factory. Okay? So that all started happening in the 1800s. Now, the problem is that the school system isn't working nearly as well as it should. Most American adults are not fully literate. Okay? And basically, when you look even at college graduates, okay, only about 25-30% of college graduates are considered proficient in literacy and numeracy. Okay, a lot of college graduates in the States and in Canada, and other countries too, are maybe intermediate. Okay, they have an intermediate level of literacy and numeracy. Okay, which means that people are going to school for 12 years, right? And then they're going to university if they're lucky. And even after all of that, like 16 years of school, they're still only intermediate level proficiency in terms of literacy and numeracy. Okay? And then if you're a dropout or just a high school grad, it's even worse, right? So the school systems that are mandatory and everything aren't really developing the skills that we want them to. And schools don't actually teach critical thinking. Okay, so in 2006, some folks did a study and they found that most teachers and even professors can't define critical thinking and don't know how to teach it. Okay, so everyone is just going through these systems. The teachers are just teaching stuff. The kids are just learning stuff. But no one's actually learning critical thinking on top of the literacy and numeracy issues. Okay? Now, all of this taken together suggests, if not demonstrates, that the world that we're living in is not the natural habitat for human beings. Okay, so before the Industrial Revolution and mandatory schooling and urbanization and all of that, human beings spent their lives as part of small communities, working with their hands and harvesting their own food. Now we live in cities where most people don't know their neighbors. We sit at home and look at screens. Children sit at desks all day learning from a standardized curriculum, which doesn't even help that much. Okay, everything is standardized, everything is systematized. Okay, most things are mass produced in factories. Okay, even humans are mass produced because of public education. Okay, and all of this started happening in the 1800s. Okay, so we've only been at this for like 200 years or so. This is an unprecedented series of changes in human history. Okay, and I don't know if people actually appreciate this because, like, returning to this concept of decolonization, okay, a lot of people tie that to European countries coming to North America or Africa or whatever, right? They attribute it to, like, okay, like, Whitey moved in and now there's problems. That's not really necessarily the issue. That's not necessarily the issue. Okay, when you look at the last 300 years of history, what you see is that standardized education, industrialization, and urbanization have basically colonized everybody. Everybody, white people, indigenous people, black people, whatever, everyone has been standardized by these systems. Everyone has been standardized, okay? And so decolonization is not really an indigenous issue. Okay, decolonization is something deeper than that. Okay, it requires looking at the systems that we're in and how they're not serving us. Okay, people go to school for 12, 16 years, are not graduating with critical thinking, are not graduating with high levels of literacy. Okay, this is a problem. This is a major problem. Okay. So basically, because of all of this stuff, human beings have been contorted, controlled, and traumatized since the 1800s. We're living and working in environments designed for efficiency, not flourishing. And everyone is suffering for it. Okay, if you look at, like, mental health numbers, statistics, and so on, like, everyone's suffering. Lots of people are depressed and so on. Okay. Now, this is where things get really interesting, at least from my perspective as a psychology researcher. Okay. So, psychology was founded as a science in 1879. Okay. Now, the problem here is that scientists only began studying human nature after 100 years of standardization. Okay, after 100 years of standardized schooling and urbanization and everything, finally psychologists were like, oh, we wonder what humans are like. Okay? And then their research subjects are predominantly people who have been subjected to all of these pressures. Okay? They were not studying humans in their natural habitats. Okay? Which means psychology has made conclusions about human nature without accounting for the conditions their research subjects are living under. Okay? They're studying standardized humans, not people growing up in their natural habitats. Okay? And even psychologists are starting to catch on to this. Okay? They have, depending on which psychologist you talk to, they have a term called WEIRD, which stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. Okay? And they point out that people under these conditions are particularly unusual compared with the rest of the species. They're frequent outliers. Okay, so all of the assumptions, or many of the assumptions that we've made about human nature are based on a skewed population. People subjected to standardized schooling and industrialization and all of it. Okay, we're studying the wrong group of humans. Okay, to figure out what human beings are like. Okay, now it gets even deeper. Okay, psychology has also made conclusions about human nature by studying the general weird population and not people living at peak potential. Okay? And the person that came across this was Abraham Maslow. Okay? So he's famous for his hierarchy of needs, but his work is actually a lot deeper than that. Okay? And they don't really teach that in schools. Okay? So Abraham Maslow, in the later stages of his career, was focused on what he called peakers, or people operating at their full potential. He was curious as a psychologist about how to help all human beings operate at peak capacity. And that's where the concept of self-actualization comes along, right? But most people, even most therapists and psychologists, have a very superficial understanding of what this actually is, right? Partially because of the populations that we've been studying, okay? So Abraham Maslow found that human beings operating at their best were very different from the average person, okay? And he says that there's no intrinsic reason why everyone shouldn't be self-actualizing. He thinks that everyone has possibilities for self-actualization, but most get it knocked out of them, okay? Which is interesting because when you think about the schooling system and the factories and blah, 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 it makes sense why he would have been discovering these kinds of things. Okay? Now, interestingly, developmental psychologists have been studying, the development of consciousness across the lifetime. Okay? So they look at, what they've done is they've studied thousands of people, and they found that different people exist at a different level of psychological development. Okay, so about 4.3% of the population is self-protective. Okay. The stage above that, they call it conformist, which is about 11% of the population. Most people exist at either expert or achiever. Okay. Which is basically like skills-based types of things. Okay, and conformist, expert, and achiever are known as formal development. Okay, that's where most of the Western world is. However, there's something called post-formal development. Okay, so about 11% of people are at individualist. Okay, where they can question their own beliefs, assumptions, and values. And they can step outside of cultural conventions, at least mentally, right? 5% of people are called strategists, where they're able to break convention strategically. And they have a different relationship with change and with the culture that they're in and so on. And then about 2% of people are at the highest levels of development, known as alchemist or unitive. Okay, and those kinds of people are the ones that Abraham Maslow would have been studying as so-called peakers. Okay? And the interesting thing is it's possible to grow into these higher stages of development But schools are not designed to do this. Universities are not designed to do this. Okay? The people who know how to help people do this are typically coaches and some therapists, and they charge a lot of money to help people do this. So most people don't have access to the resources that they would need. They never encounter it in school, they never encounter it in university, right? And if you don't have thousands of dollars to spend on therapy and coaching, you're just not going to have the resources you need to develop into a post-formal capacity. Okay? So that's kind of what I wanted to cover. That's kind of what I wanted to cover is this whole idea of colonization and decolonization and so on. People see it as an indigenous versus European thing. They see it as like, you know, an indigenous issue. But it's really not. It's really not. Okay? Because from the perspective of psychology and history and so on, everyone is subjected to certain influences, systemic influences, okay, that hamper their growth, standardize them, in some cases leaves them either partially or fully illiterate, okay? Like it's really not an indigenous issue. It's an issue with the education system. It's an issue with how psychology is drawing conclusions about human nature. Okay, so the issues are a little bit deeper than like, oh, we need more indigenous art in museums. Okay, it's a little bit deeper than that. So I don't know if that was interesting. Like maybe you've never thought about those issues that way before. Um, if you are interested in like a really in-depth look at these issues, I have a book called Ticket to Heaven, link in description. It's got 1,000 references. I spend a lot of time ripping apart Western systems. I spend a lot of time and a lot of references going through psychology and neuroscience and so on. And yeah, like we deserve better. Better is available, but most people don't know that better is available, and it's a real tragedy. So anyway, that's the video I made. I'm gonna be posting more things about psychology and stuff on my channel, but um, yeah, I had the time to make this video, so I figured I would. Um, yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments. Like, I'm curious what you think of this. And yeah, if you liked this, like and subscribe for more.